To our podcast, the Women's Rights Network here. We've got Mary Howden and Anna Wilson and from the network. And we're really pleased to have join us is Rhona Hotchkiss, who was previously a prisoner governor. She also has a long history of working in the NHS and is currently a board member for NHS Improvement. And on the LGB Alliance as well. So lots of experience there. But we primarily would like to talk to Rhona about her experience as a prisoner governor. And to give us, I guess, the other side of the discussion that we had, if you've listened to our other podcast, where we had a discussion with a female prisoner who had been in prison with trans identifying men. So, Rhona, welcome. Really nice to see you.
Thank you for having me on.
Do tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, you kind of got it in the intro there. I started out my professional working life as a nurse, specialised mostly in intensive care and cardiac surgery. And then I became a project manager at national level, was a nurse advisor at Scottish Executive, then became Scottish Government. Worked in consultancy for a while, and I was a director at an NHS board, and then I changed tack completely and went into the prison service as deputy governor. I had been on the team of the chief inspector for prisons as the health inspector for a few years as a part-time thing with one of my other roles, but I jumped ship and went straight into the prison service as the deputy governor of Berlin, which was a big thrill for a Glasgow lassie. Yeah. And I spent 10 years in the prison service. I was deputy governor at Berlin and then Shotts. Then I was the governor of Dumfries and then Cornwall Vale and then Greenock. And I retired a couple of years ago.
So you've got a really large experience of all the different prisons that there are in Scotland, which is interesting. I have been in some of them. I worked as a social worker, and so I have been in Berlin many, many years ago. And Cornwall Vale and Shotts and a couple of others. So I have some sense of what they're like, but obviously it's a long time ago and things were quite different in those days. Yep. So what made you jump from the NHS to the prison service? That's quite different, isn't it, in a way?
Well, yes, I suppose so. When I worked on the team for the chief inspector of prisons, I remember saying to people, oh, if I had my time again, you know, I might join the prison service. I felt very comfortable there. I suppose it's like a hospital, it's just a big institution with a lot of people in trouble. And then for the first time in its history, the Scottish Prison Service opened up recruitment at deputy governor level. They'd never done it before. And I have to add, I've never done it since. So probably a terrible reflection on me. I bet they're regretting it now for sure. But so I applied and I got in. And interestingly, they took 3 of us, and it was 3 women they took. The other one had a background in private banking. And the third one had a background in managing an IT company. So they took in, and they wanted to do that. They wanted to bring in people with different experience and a different take on things. So that's how it happened.
Right. So the discussion that we had with Amanda was very much about, from her perspective, and being in prison with men who were identifying as women. And I suppose we wanted to ask you is how did that come about? How did that, you know, how was that enabled or allowed to happen?
Sure. Well, when I was working in Berlin in 2011, we got a trans-identified male into Berlin, someone who had identified as that in the community before they were convicted, not as you see happening now. People suddenly become trans when they're arrested or go to court, which is becoming fairly common. And when they were being sent to Berlin, someone from the court phoned us, it might even have been social work, Mary, I'm not sure, and said this person was coming in. And I was absolutely appalled that they would be sending a trans person, a trans-identified male, to a male prison. So I did my best for them. We cleared reception and we asked if there were any female staff who would do the searches, and myself and a female manager volunteered to do it if no one else would. And I almost immediately arranged for the transfer to Cornwall Vale. And I know it's appalling. And at that time, the Scottish Prison Service had no policy on trans-identified males coming into prison, because it just so rarely happened. You know, it was just, when it did, it was just dealt with on a very individual basis. It was highly unusual. Most people who work in the prison service have never met a trans person. So appalled as I was, I sent them to Court and Vale. Yeah, it was a bit naive at the time, but there you go. Well, so, following that, then I agitated for a policy to be developed, and it was developed, but it took quite a while. I think it came out in about, it might have been sometime around then, within, if not that year, then maybe a year or whatever later. I can't honestly remember. It might have been as late as 2013, because sometimes the wheels grind slowly. So the policy was developed, and it was developed not out of malice by the prison service, but out of a naivety, a kind of naivety that I had as well, I think, at the time, because this was such a side issue. It was such a tiny issue for the prison service at the time. It was so unusual. And they turned for advice to the Scottish Trans Alliance. So the policy was developed by, I think, one person from the prison service and the Trans Alliance, which, with hindsight, I wasn't involved in the development of it, but it was a really big mistake. But they thought they were doing the right thing and trying to find out about the needs and so on of trans people without ever considering the impact on women. And that's how it came about.
Right. Well, I think, you know, what you're describing there about that, you know, kind of naivety, or even a wish to be kind almost.
Yes, yes.
I think many of us have experienced that. I certainly have. You know, so I don't think, you know, I don't think it's uncommon, I suppose, really. So what do you think the kind of consequences are then for female prisoners of, you know, having had that policy in place? It's under review as well, isn't it, at the moment? Or
it is under review, but it's taken its time. I mean, it's supposedly been under review for about, or at least 3 years, and we're still waiting for it to come out. Now, to be fair to the Scottish Prison Service, they have done a lot of consultation over the last 5-6 months or so in preparing to bring out a new policy. So they've consulted quite widely, and I spoke to them for an hour. They've spoken to various groups and so on. So they have done a better job, I think, of consulting this time round. But the consequences for women have been quite severe. I think the Scottish Prison Service actually did a bit of research on this a couple of years ago, and they don't publicise it now. It was done by a researcher who, and it's not difficult to tell from the way the papers are written, that they're very sympathetic to the trans cause, if you like, and to trans activism. And they use disputed language like cis people and transphobia and all of this kind of thing. So it's loaded with pro-trans terminology. So what they did was, it was one man that did it, and he went in and spoke to women in prison about their thoughts and, you know, their reaction to having trans-identified males with them. He spoke to a group of women, he spoke to a group of staff, and he spoke to a few trans people as well. Despite all of that, despite the fact that he was pro-trans, despite the fact he's a middle-class man, 80% of the women he spoke to had concerns, ranging from the more minor to the really, really serious. And despite all of that, the spin that was put on all the papers was appalling. So you've got 80% of women who've got concerns, and you've got 20% of women who said, I don't mind, they're just little lassies and all that kind of thing. And yet the bulk of the quotes in the paper were trans positive. When it came to the staff's opinions and attitudes, again, the majority of staff had concerns about it, but the bulk of the commentary was given over to staff who were okay with it. And I thought that the paper on staff was quite appalling. It really denigrated them, and it, you know, it said that staff who were opposed to it were uneducated, and it was an absolute disgrace, real disgrace. And then, of course, the paper that was about, and I think it was called something like The Pains of Trans Imprisonment or something, was entirely positive about trans-identified males in women's prisons.
That's also quite a dramatic title, isn't it?
It's a play on a famous paper called The Pains of Imprisonment, or a famous book that came out about what it does to people to be in prison. So it was a play on that.
Right.
Yeah.
Do the trans identifying females go to the female prison or the male prison estate?
Well, they're outnumbered by trans-identifying males by some huge proportion. I can't remember. So while I met quite a few trans-identified males in prison, I only met one trans-identified woman, and she did not go to the male estate. I know that there have been, and I think possibly even are now, one or two who have gone to the male estate. Some have had to be returned, and I believe that there's one who's there now, but I'm not entirely sure about that. The funny thing about it is, though, that if you put a trans-identified male in a women's prison, the risk is all to the women. If you put a trans-identified woman in a male prison, the risk is all to her. And that alone should tell you what the nature of this thing is, that men are a risk to women wherever you mix them and however they identify. So that's a really clear indicator for me of what the issue is.
Mm. Yeah,
and
that's
there'll be a risk
about...
to all women, the staff that are female as well.
Yes,
as the prisoners.
yes. And when you say risk, I mean, people say, you know, people like Rhona Robertson, just it's so irritating. I don't know if they're just being disingenuous or if they're really thick. So they say things like trans people are not a risk. No one is saying that trans-identified males are more of a risk than men. They pose the same risk as men. So what people should be saying to themselves is, why do we ever separate males out from females? And of course people will come up with reasons about privacy, dignity for both sexes, but for women it's about safety and emotional well-being. And the same applies to trans-identified males. They pose exactly the same risk to women's safety and well-being as do any other men, because they are a subset of men, not a subset of women. And it really annoys me when people say, oh, you're saying that trans people are a danger. No, we're not. Not unless you're saying we're saying that men are a danger. You know, it's exactly the same thing. And it's either disingenuous or stupid to not be able to think that through.
Well, I don't for a minute believe that when Rhona Robertson was presenting the GLA bill, that she believed that statement, that people don't pretend to be something to gain access to. I don't believe that she believed
well,
that.
There's now dozens and dozens of examples of trans-identified males assaulting women in what should have been private and safe spaces, including in prisons. Prisons, toilets, changing rooms, you know, school toilets. It's absolutely rife now. And it is just, it's nonsensical to think for a minute that Rhona Robertson doesn't know that. Either that or whoever's doing our research for the Scottish Government is not a proper researcher.
Well, there is that.
Yeah. Except I know that most civil servants are very skilled at this stuff. They are, you know, but civil servants follow a brief in general. So
they do. And I like you, my experience of civil servants was that they were very good at researching issues and giving a balance to the ministers that they were reporting to. So yeah.
That's right.
Do we know what the current statistics are for trans?
Yeah, the Scottish Prison Service undertook to release those statistics, and I can't remember if it's a monthly or monthly basis or whatever. So I believe there are about 13 trans-identified males in the estate just now. Not all of the majority of them in the women's estate, but some of them still in the male estate. And some trans-identified males either choose not to go to the female estate, or they want to wait until they've started hormone treatment or whatever. So it's a mixed picture. But I would say that the default position is now to place them in the women's estate after I think quite a poor risk assessment, which only looks at, it does look at the risk they pose, but it doesn't take women's feelings, opinions, whatever into consideration.
Religion.
Oh, anything at all. You're absolutely right. Religious minorities, ethnic minorities, and so on. And of course, you're right. You mentioned female staff, and of course, an awful lot of female staff are really not happy about having to do strip searches on, I was going to call them male-bodied people. They're men. Don't want to do strip searches on men, and male staff don't want to do them on women either. You know, you're asking, for example, male officers in their 40s and 50s to do strip searches on wee lassies, what are wee lassies to them? You know, young girls young enough to be their daughters, and it's absolutely horrible. We shouldn't be doing that to staff and forcing them to do it as well.
So it is, you can have the trans identifying men on no hormones and no surgery.
Absolutely.
If they say they're female, they get put in the female estate.
Yeah, in all of the people that I met, I think there was one who had had surgery, and it was a couple of decades before. The rest of them, no. And the majority don't identify as trans until they're arrested or brought to court or sentenced, or indeed already in prison. So no, of course they've not had surgery. And I would say most of them have absolutely no intentions of doing it.
And there are issues about when they come out of prison, going back to, isn't there? I've seen reports of that in the papers about, I mean, I don't know how common that is, but...
Well, some of that was in those research papers that I was talking about, where women in prison, I guess men in prison as well, but women are just better communicators and better networkers. So they were in touch with women who had been in prison, had got out, or women had got out, come back in or whatever. And they were telling of instances where they knew that people who had identified as trans in prison stopped the second they got out of prison, but that they would fully intend to do it again should they ever come back in. I mean, it's a big piss take by some of these men. It's a deliberate piss take by them. Because they think it'll be easier. It probably is easier in a women's prison. Some long-term prisoners who do it, and any prison officer, if they weren't civil servants and could speak publicly, and that's part of the problem. You can't speak because you're actually a civil servant. You'll lose your job. So a lot of the prison officers would tell you that most of these long-term prisoners that suddenly identify as trans, they're people with a history of buggeration factor. Do you know what I mean? They're people that do everything they can to muck up the system. This is just the latest jape, do you know what I mean, to relieve the boredom of a long-term sentence. So they're highly manipulative people who want to just do the next thing they can to be a damn nuisance.
And is there still an issue where women tend to be jailed for very minor offences?
It's not as bad as people think. So if you think about television licences, nobody's been jailed in Scotland for not paying a television licence for about 8 or 9 years now. It doesn't happen. Yes, women do go to jail for shoplifting, but never for a first shoplifting. I'm not saying it's right. I mean, I think we should have about a third of the women in prison that we have now, and was trying to work towards that when I was there. But I think there's a difficulty here because we can't defund prisons in order to give more money to the community. The community certainly needs more. We need to invest a lot more in prevention, in diversion, in supporting women and all of these kind of things. But you can't make prisons more horrible in order to get it right in the community. So what would be needed would be 5 to 10 years of dual investment. So you keep doing the good things that happen in prison, but all the time you're trying to siphon people off so that we end up with about a third of the number of women we've got in prison in now. It's true that the majority of women who go to prison go for non-violent offences, but the majority of women in prison on any one day are in for violent offences. So do you know what I mean? There's a difference there between incidence and prevalence. Yes. So the incidence of women in prison is mostly non-violent, but the prevalence in prison is violence. So, you know, that, and I think people get a bit confused about that. So there are hundreds and hundreds of women go to prison every year, most of them non-violent. There's about 380 women in prison, and more than half of them will be in for offences of violence because it includes long-term sentence prisoners and so on. Yeah.
That's helpful to kind of spell that out for us.
Yeah, that's an interesting fact. I didn't know.
Yeah.
So, and the offences that men tend to be to have committed that are in the female estate, what sort of offences are they?
Well, there's a range of offences. Some of them, as I say, are long-term prisoners, so they will be in for murder. But some of them will be short-term offenders, so they'll be in for more minor assaults or any of the drug trafficking, any of these kind of drug dealing, any of these kind of things that you would expect people would be in prison for. The problem is that in order for someone to be currently refused or considered too much of a risk to go to the women's estate. And this is before GRCs, because I never met anybody in prison with GRC. The only reason that they would do that is if they are presenting a current threat to women. So if they are voicing threats of rape or assault to women, they wouldn't. Or if their index offence, which is the offence they're in for now, was rape, then they wouldn't send them. But of course, the fear is that with making the obtaining of a GRC so easy with self-ID, that it will be very, very difficult to exclude any man claiming he's a woman, regardless of what he's done. It'll come down to test cases, but we saw the case in England where a woman took the MOJ to court because she was sexually assaulted by a trans-identifying male in prison. And the judge said that he recognised that women could and would be harmed, but he still didn't rule against it.
Yeah.
So that's the worrying thing. You only need a precedent like that, and the floodgates will open.
And I think the thing about the current GLA bill is this bit about you have to live as that, your whatever gender identity means, because we don't have a definition of that.
No.
But you have to live as that for 3 months, which means that you are saying you are what you are without anything. And I think that that just opens up that whole principle of well, you can say whatever you want really in terms of how you identify.
Well, that's the issue, isn't it? Because it's, I think it talks about living as the other sex. Well, they're immediately admit there's a binary, but or living as a woman. Who lives as a woman? What does that mean? I don't live as a woman. I am a woman. So what does it mean to live as a woman? Does it mean you do your hair in a particular way, or you wear makeup, or you like pink, or you don't like pink, or what on earth does it mean? And they shy away from definitions because they know it's absolute nonsense.
Mm-hmm. I during the election there, I had a conversation with one of the local councillors, and I was saying to her, she was saying, about living as a woman, and I looked at her and I said, so what does that mean actually? Yeah. And she said, well, they wear dresses and lipstick, and I said, well, I don't. So does that mean I'm not a woman?
I know, it's just a nonsense.
It is a nonsense. And actually, unless you're a woman, you don't really know what it's like. You just are a woman. You don't know.
Absolutely.
You don't.
No two women feel the same. So the three of us all feel differently. All we know is how we feel.
Absolutely.
It's a common theme throughout all the podcasts. We all say, what does it mean to live as a woman? What does that feel like? We don't know.
We have a commonality of experience. So all three of us, and I know this, will know the fear of walking along a dark road at night and hearing footsteps behind us. There's a common or getting on a train and it's just you and one guy. So we all know that. We all know what that feels like, in a way that men just don't.
And the other thing we all know what it feels like is when you're working and you've got men who talk over you or take your ideas, or that's another common experience I think that women have, where that whole bit about your value and your worth is diminished if you're actually mixing with colleagues who are males who want to actually progress up a career ladder or whatever.
That's true.
That's right. And when women have children and go part-time to look after those children, that's the career prospects dead in the water.
Exactly.
But the men that are all fathers continue up the ladder.
I think it's important. Not to fall into the trap of talking about women's bodily functions when we say that we all have that experience, because some women don't menstruate. I don't have children. All of these kind of things. But I think we have to accept that women as a species menstruate. We menstruate. That we have breasts. All of these kind of things. And there was that hideously egregious paper was put forward at one stage in the consultation of this bill. It was quoted by the Scottish Government, and in it was the suggestion that trans-identified males are like women who've had bilateral mastectomies. I just thought, I won't swear too badly on here, but that's just, it's disgusting. Oh, it's appalling.
It is disgusting, and it's and it's that kind of minimizing of women's experience of cancer and what that does to you and your sense of self and all of these things. It's just appalling. We're coming towards the end, Rhona, and there was just one thing we wanted to ask you about, was the training that staff in prisons receive. Is that as biased in terms of, you know, the whole kind of Stonewall input around the equalities, as they say, law, which in fact isn't actually accurate?
It only started to come in about 18 months or 2 years before I left. And I did try to point out to the head of college the egregious nonsense that was up on the screens in the college about the suicidality rate in trans-identified young people. It was from a totally debunked study and so on. The problem with the prison service is that it's a command and control structure. And it has to be for it to run when things go really wrong. You know, you have to have people who do what they're told without arguing. A bit military in that way. But it also, of course, exists to implement Scottish Government policy. So if it's the Scottish Government's policy and belief that trans women are women, that's what will be taught to the prison service, because they're the civil service. You know, it's the same with a lot of the training now for civil servants and the pressure to put your pronouns in your email signature and so on. Civil service is pretty hierarchical as well, and they are there to serve the government, to inform the government, to support the government, but mostly to implement the policies that a democratically elected government brings in. And it's the same for the prison service. So the prison service will do what the government tells them.
Yeah.
And do the staff have any option to state a different opinion, or are they just...
Well, they can. They can, but it won't make any difference. You know, they'll still have to do what they're required to do by policy and procedure. So, for example, when I was one of my governor posts, I had staff who said they were going to refuse to strip search the opposite sex, and I said, "You're quite right, and I'll support you." And when I told headquarters that was what I intended to do, they said to me, "That's not wise of you to do that. That's not very helpful and it's not very useful." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And nobody ever got back to me and said, and I said, "Well, that's what I'll be doing." so that was that. But unfortunately, the Prison Officers Union isn't really standing up for staff on this one. Some of the individual union reps are, but the overall union is not standing up for staff on this, in my opinion, because they're tied too closely to the current government. And that can happen with any government. I'm not saying it's that union and that government. That can happen with any union in any government, but they were.
And one final question is, what can we do to kind of counter some of this? What are the things that you think are helpful?
Well, just keep the pressure on politicians. Keep pointing out to them that it's all very well to think about people in prison as somebody else, but it could be us. That could be our daughters, our aunt, whoever. And I've spoken to women who've been in prison, who are middle class and so on, you know, who say, older women, an older woman particularly, who said she would have been terrified. And I know that women in prison are frightened. I know that women in prison are intimidated by the violence and aggression of trans-identified males, by their overtly sexualised behaviour. They don't want them sharing their spaces. And I'm talking about the majority of women here, we know that. So just keep the pressure up and don't let this drop from politicians and the public's view, and keep pressing home the evidence and the truth about what it does to women in prison to have male-bodied men in their intimate living spaces. And it's not just the physical harm, it's not just the threat of sexual assault, it's the gaslighting that goes on. It's the gaslighting that staff are forced to do when women say that's a man, and staff have to say no, it's not. And we're talking about women with lifetimes, decades of abuse at the hands of men, women with multiple mental health issues and so on, being forced to pretend that guy with the erection and the tight trousers isn't a man. It's absolutely disgusting.
It is. So on that note, I think we will look for ways to kind of continue to kind of keep that pressure up. Yeah. I wish we had more time, Rhona. That was absolutely really helpful, and thank you so much for giving Rhona. Us your time.
Thanks very much. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Bye-bye. Bye.